before I jump into my presentation officially, it is mostly factual information, but there is a little bit of soapboxing in this one. So I just want to start us off with a couple of disclaimers. Firstly, that this is opinions are all my own. Me, Adrian Sandoval, as a game developer and human being, they do not represent the Philly IGDA board as a whole. They do not represent any views from IGDA National Organization or any other IGDA affiliated chapter or special interest group. I promise you it's not as spicy as what it seems from that. But that being said, we are going to be getting into some legal information in this talk, and I want to also disclaim that I am not, in fact, a lawyer. All the facts that I am presenting is going to be based on my personal research from other scholars as well as legal experts. Nothing should be construed as legal advice. I am going to provide sources for all the research. I'm going to have these slides are going to get shared on the IGDA Discord, and they have all of the sources inside of it, and I am going to put a couple of links in the chat once we are done the presentation. And I already see people are talking in the chat. I will take a look at the chat once we are done, but we are going to jump into what we're talking about today, and that is the DMCA, video game preservation, and why these things matter. And that is a series of letters that you might be familiar with, but if you are not, I'm going to explain them in just a little bit. But as many of you know, I am Adrian Sandoval. I am the IGDA Philly chair, but I have also been a game developer for some time as well as a writer. But on top of these things, I also teach video game history at the University of the Arts and Drexel University in Philadelphia. And video game preservation, as a historian, is something that is important to me, as well as important to me as a developer in this industry for close to 15 years now, which is why I wanted to give tonight's presentation on the DMCA as it relates to some new and recent developments in the game preservation space, which we're going to get into shortly. But before all of that, a primer to what the DMCA is, or at least what I can fit into a minute or so when we're talking about an article of copyright law. So the Digital Media Copyright Act was a law enacted in October of 1998 that offers copyright holders of digital media certain legal protections to protect their copyright. This has many provisions, but I'm specifically focusing on Section 1201 tonight, which prohibits users from circumventing protections of digital media meant to restrict access. Now, in layman's terms, this allows companies to install piracy countermeasures in their digital media, be it books, movies, music, video games, etc., and prohibits people from circumventing those countermeasures through hacking or other means. We typically call these countermeasures DRM, or digital rights management, and that carries a whole lot of baggage that we can't possibly cover tonight. But I do want to be upfront and say that this is not a talk arguing in favor of limiting or removing DRM entirely, because honestly, we shouldn't have to. And 1201 does actually account for that, because 1201 provides exemptions to the DMCA, allowing for certain groups to be legally able to circumvent these countermeasures. And I'm specifically talking about museums, libraries, and other educational institutions, specifically to allow for the scholarly study and preservation of digital media, which is a big concern since we live in an age where media is being created and distributed exclusively through the internet with no physical format existing whatsoever. And today's exemptions allow for an educational institution to not only provide access to most digital media that are in their archives at a physical location, but they can also do so online as well. So if a library has a book or a movie in its archive, that library is legally allowed to provide someone who requests access to that media a way to stream it or otherwise access it from home, which is fantastic news for accessible research and preservation efforts. But you might have noticed I said most media, because not all forms of digital media have been granted that exemption. And I'm guessing you probably know this is where this is going. I'm talking about video games. Now, video games do have limited exemption. Specifically, games in an archive are allowed to be accessed on site, meaning you physically have to be at the museum or library to play a game for research purposes. And this is impractical for a number of reasons, but the biggest one being that unlike, say, a movie, a game's length can vary wildly from 10 minutes to 40 hours to 100 and 150 plus hours. Asking a researcher to travel to a specific institution and use their site for several hours a day for potentially multiple weeks is unrealistic, and that's without considering other major factors such as, say, physical disability. And we have to ask ourselves, why does the biggest commercial artistic medium not get offered the same legal access and exemptions for academic research as other mediums? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that question is also very disappointing. The Entertainment Software Association, the lobbyist group that represents the major video game companies, has been actively arguing against license exemptions for games. And I can't cover all of their arguments in depth that they do deserve, because I do want to represent their argument as fairly as possible. The essential point underlying their argument is that by allowing digital access to games, educational institutions could allow for untethered access to said games that would ultimately hurt the company's bottom line, specifically when it comes to the current market for remakes, reissues, and remasters of video games from a company's back catalog. That could be rendered moot should libraries be allowed to grant digital access. There's a lot to unpack with that argument, especially if we think about how historical non-video game media like movies are treated and sold in the marketplace. But to keep it brief, I want to focus on what the effect this has had on games and preservation as a whole. Just yesterday, the Video Game History Foundation and the Software Preservation Network published a study that found that 87% of the video games published before 2010 are critically endangered, specifically meaning they are unavailable for purchase or digital access through legal means. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I actually participated in this study to a small degree, but regardless, 87% is a staggering number. And if you look at the details of the study, that puts video games at risk in the same bracket as older media such as silent film. So for context, video games, a medium that has only been around for about 50 years, are at risk at having its history becoming lost in the same way as works that are over 100 years old. And why that matters in the context of this audience, us working video game professionals, well, speaking personally, most of my professional work has been either for the Nintendo DS platform or mobile phones. And with the closure of Nintendo's digital market space for that DS platform and the obsolescence of older phones, the vast majority of my professional output is now completely inaccessible. And because those games specifically targeted the casual and educational markets, they aren't likely to ever be reissued or remastered. But this isn't about my own ego or that I see my team's games as grand artistic statements. They, like all games, provide important historical context. This was a time where educational games and training applications were being made for video game hardware because smartphones didn't exist at all, and the Nintendo DS system was the most mass market, widely adopted platform. So games such as the ones I worked on, hundreds of other games in the casual DS market, and honestly, all games, past, present, and future, are cultural artifacts. They tell us something about the time they were created and the people who developed and played them in their time. And yet, under the ESA's watch, only a handful of the most popular mass market games have been deemed worthy of preservation and reissue. Now, I want to end this on a positive note. So the goal of this study by the Video Game History Foundation and Software Preservation Network is hopefully going to be the linchpin when arguing for an exemption for Section 1201, because new exemptions are going to be discussed next year in October of 2024. But even if this does go through, this is not going to be the end of the conversation. There are still many more preservation efforts that need to happen, such as infrastructure needing to be created for educational institutions to allow for that streaming access. There's going to be certain definitions and clarifications that are going to be argued in the intervening years. But ultimately, I see us gaining this exemption as a necessary step for preserving games and for games to be seen as an artistic medium as a whole. They are an important part of our cultural identity, and they need to be treated as such. But regardless of my own feelings on this, my hope is that you learned something today about our current copyright laws, how they currently relate to video games and game preservation as a whole, at least as much as I could do in a short period of time. Thank you all. Really quickly, before I go to questions, I do want to quickly acknowledge the people behind my sources and research. First of all, Phil Salvador, who is the library director for the Video Game History Foundation and was the author of this survey for the video game reissue market. Kelsey Lewin, who is the co-director of the Video Game History Foundation, who also helped facilitate the survey. Also, a quick shout out to the co-director, Frank Sfaldi. He did not work on the survey, but he is the founder of the foundation as a whole. Brandon Butler is the law and policy advisor for the Software Preservation Network, and a lot of the DMCA information was from Kendra Albert, who is a clinical instructor at the Cyber Law Clinic at Harvard Law. So thank you to all those folks. Yeah, thank you so much for the praise in the chat. I really appreciate it. Does anyone have any questions?
So how do you solve it?
I mean, that is a very long and multifaceted conversation, and that could be a long thing. I mean, the hope is that this in 5 minutes. I mean, the hope is that this survey is at least a step towards, again, granting libraries access, right? There's a lot of information that I didn't go into in this conversation, because if you let me actually start grabbing the links that I wanted to post in the chat, including to the actual study and the study explainer, because they go into a lot more information. Because like some of the things that you'll hear on the internet, specifically, mostly you hear about piracy. A lot of people in the game preservation space, there are a lot of people who say, piracy, we'll just pirate everything. But like, I don't think that, I mean, that's sad, right? Like, we don't say that about films and books, right? And that's what part of the problem that I had that I didn't go in super in depth about, that games are not treated in the same way that books and movies are. Like, when you think about that idea that like they could have untethered access to games, like we don't say that about books and movies. Could you imagine that being an argument for why we can't have libraries, right? So my hope is that with this survey, that when new exemptions come up, we kind of start that process, right? We get this exemption that allows for people to not have to pirate, right? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great if like people could just like take a look at these things recently and see? Have specific politicians been identified based on committee assignments to target lobbying? I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't know about specific politicians. I just know about the groups such as the Software Preservation Network, the Cyber Law Clinic, the lawyers essentially who are going to Congress to fight against the ESA. One of the things that I mentioned that there is a hearing in 2024 to provide new exemptions. So what ends up happening is every 3 years, the Library of Congress opens the discussion to either like which ones should be renewed, which ones should be changed, and what new exemptions should be added. And in fact, like so like this idea of like games having like on-site access. Well, actually, no. One thing that happened, for example, is that in 2018, software was finally allowed to have digital access. How do video games differ from software? Not a lot of people know. But to answer your question, I'm not 100% sure about specific politicians. I just know about the organizations that are going against the lobbying group.
Yeah, just sort of curious in terms of if we've got a year till the next attempt, where does a chapter like us or RGDA and mass, or organizations, academic institutions like Drexel, where do you focus your energy for maximum impact? Is it supporting the Video Game History Foundation? It's because I think you only make change if you actually can concentrate all that concern in,
Yeah, that is part of the reason why the Video Game History Foundation was created in the first place, to be able to have groups that can do something like this, or assist groups like the Software Preservation Network that are more generally software focused instead of video games. IGDA did used to have a game preservation SIG. It is not currently active. I'd like to see that change in the next couple of years. I'd love to see, like I said, like IGDA does not endorse any of the opinions of my own in this, but like it would be cool if they did, or at least that if there was an arm of IGDA. But yeah, right now the best target are the organizations that are actually like paying lawyers to represent them in court, and that includes again the Software Preservation Network and Video Game History Foundation.